John Parker's life had settled into a quiet rhythm, marked by solitude and the soft echoes of a love he had lost 5 years ago. Since Melanie passed, he spent his days immersed in small projects around his modest, ranch-style home, nestled at the end of a gravel road in Springfield, Missouri. Surrounded by open fields and scattered clusters of oak trees, the house embodied simplicity, the kind that offered ample time for reflection, and for loneliness to settle in like an unwelcome guest. The day his life pivoted forever began as any other. John sat at the local diner, the same place where he and Melanie had once shared countless Saturday mornings over stacks of fluffy pancakes. His coffee sat cooling in front of him as he stared out the window, lost in memories. Then, a headline in the day-old newspaper lying on the counter caught his eye. Local tragedy claims young parents, 2 children left behind. Intrigued, he read the article once, then again. Caleb, 10, and Mason, 7, had lost their parents in a car accident just outside town. The article noted that no close relatives had come forward to take them in, leaving the boys adrift in the foster care system. As John set the paper down, a weight settled in his chest, deep, unshakable. Melanie's words surfaced, her voice as vivid, as if she were sitting beside him. If we can't have kids of our own, maybe we're meant to help someone who needs us. The diner seemed to fall silent, her words reverberating with a clarity that felt like fate calling his name. 2 weeks later, John found himself sitting in his lawyer's office. Adoption papers were spread across the desk, their weight both literal and figurative. This wasn't a decision he had anticipated, but once the idea took root, it grew unstoppable. He wasn't just signing up to adopt 2 boys. He was committing to a future brimming with uncertainty and possibility. As his pen hovered over the dotted line, the lawyer, a gray-haired man with a skeptical expression, raised an eyebrow. "You know folks around here are going to talk," he said, his voice tinged with warning. John paused, the pen trembling for a brief moment before continuing. His reply was firm, resolute. "Let them talk." When he walked out of the office, the paperwork complete, a sense of purpose stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. The first meeting with Caleb and Mason was arranged at the children's home, a brick building on Springfield's outskirts. The sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria food, while the hum of children's chatter echoed down the hallways. John sat in a plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees waiting. His nerves felt raw, every second stretching into an eternity. When the boys finally entered, John stood. Caleb led the way, his dark, cautious eyes scanning the room like a sentinel. Though only 10, he carried himself with a gravity far beyond his years, his small shoulders seemingly bearing the weight of the world. Behind him, Mason clung to his brother's shirt, his steps hesitant. At just 7, he appeared heartbreakingly small, but the curiosity flickering in his eyes hinted at a spark yet unextinguished. "Hi boys," John said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I'm John Parker." Caleb didn't reply immediately. He studied John with a guarded intensity, as though trying to decipher whether this man was just another fleeting figure in their lives. Meanwhile, Mason whispered something to his brother, who nodded before speaking. "Are you really going to take both of us?" Caleb asked, his voice soft but steady. John knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "That's the only way this works," he replied firmly. "You and Mason come as a package deal." Mason peeked out from behind his brother, his small lips trembling. "For how long?" he asked in a barely audible voice. "For good," John answered, the weight of his promise sinking into the room. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long haul. You boys are going to have a home with me." The words lingered, heavy with meaning. The boys exchanged uncertain glances, their skepticism born from too many broken promises. But then, Mason stepped forward, releasing his grip on Caleb's shirt. Tentatively he reached out, his small hand extending toward John. John didn't hesitate. He took Mason's hand, feeling its fragility, and the unspoken trust within that single gesture. The ride home was quiet, the air punctuated only by the crunch of gravel beneath the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat huddled together in the back seat, their small backpacks clutched tightly. John glanced at them in the rearview mirror, a swell of protectiveness and uncertainty filling his chest. As they pulled into the driveway, Mason finally spoke. "It's big," he murmured, staring at the house. "It's home," John replied simply. He led the boys inside, showing them their shared bedroom. It was modest but cozy, with twin beds and a window overlooking the backyard. Caleb set his backpack down cautiously, his eyes scanning every corner of the room, while Mason bounced slightly on one of the beds. "I know this is new and maybe a little scary," John began, his voice low and steady. But I want you to know something important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now. And I'll be here for you. No matter what. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment, John feared resistance. But then the boy gave a small nod. Mason, meanwhile, whispered one word, promise? John's voice was resolute. I promise. In that moment, he knew he'd made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The nights were the hardest, and Mason found himself trapped in a whirlwind of nightmares that left him shaking and in tears. One particular night, his cries pierced the silence, and John rushed into his room. Mason clung to him, trembling. John sat beside him on the bed, wrapping an arm around the boy's fragile shoulders. Was it the accident again? John asked gently, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. Mason nodded, his small face buried against John's chest. I miss them, Mason whispered, his voice barely audible but weighted with heartbreak. I know you do, John replied, his own voice thick with emotion. It's okay to miss them. It's okay to feel sad. But you're not alone, Mason. I'm here. In that moment, as Mason clung tighter, John felt a crack in the walls the boys had built around their hearts. For Mason, it was a step toward healing. But Caleb was a different story. He wore his pain like armor, silent and unyielding. His stoic demeanor left John guessing, unsure of what lay beneath the surface. One evening, as John worked to fix a broken step on the porch, Caleb approached, holding a small wooden box. He hesitated before handing it over. What's this? John asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Caleb glanced down. Pictures, he said quietly. Inside the box were photographs, family portraits and candid snapshots of their parents. I don't want Mason to see these yet, Caleb continued. He's not ready. John nodded solemnly, carefully closing the box. You're a good big brother, he said softly. Caleb shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, pride maybe. It's just what I do, he muttered. Small victories began to bloom. Mason's laughter, once a rarity, started to echo through the house, warm and genuine. Caleb, ever composed, showed an interest in John's carpentry projects. His eyes fixed intently as John demonstrated how to sand and stain wood. Progress was slow, but the boys were healing. Spring arrived early that year, bringing a burst of warmth and color. John saw it as an opportunity to integrate the boys into the community, despite the lingering skepticism that surrounded them. He signed Caleb up for basketball, Mason for soccer, and the family volunteered for the town's cleanup day. The first game day was a test. Caleb, clad in his new basketball jersey, stepped onto the court. Parents on the sidelines exchanged whispers, their glances cutting between Caleb and John. But as the game began, Caleb's skill silenced them. His speed, precision, and focus were undeniable. By halftime, even the doubters watched with grudging admiration. After the game, a man in a baseball cap approached John, extending a hand. He's got talent, he said gruffly. You must be proud. John shook the man's hand firmly. I am. He's worked hard, he replied, his words simple but meaningful. At the town cleanup day, Mason's lively chatter drew smiles from volunteers as they repainted the gazebo. He's got a way of making work feel lighter, an older woman commented, watching Mason attempt to paint a straight line. Caleb, on the other hand, worked quietly but diligently, his precise brushstrokes catching the attention of others. The real breakthrough came at the town's spring festival. Mason entered the art contest with a painting of his late parents, a heartfelt tribute that radiated love and warmth. When his name was announced as the winner, the applause was genuine. The whispers of judgment seemed to fade as people saw the boys not as outsiders, but as part of the community. Even Caleb felt the change. It feels different, he said quietly as they walked home. What does? John asked. People, Caleb replied, glancing back at the glowing lights of the square. They're not looking at us the same way. John smiled. That's because they're starting to see what I see. Two amazing kids who belong here. The transformation was tested one stormy evening. The sky darkened and winds roared through the town. When the power went out, John guided the boys to the basement as rain lashed against the house. Caleb sat protectively beside Mason, his arm around his younger brother. When the storm passed, the destruction was evident. Shingles scattered across yards, fences toppled, and a neighbor's roof partially collapsed. John turned to the boys. Let's get to work. There are people who need help. Over the next few days, they threw themselves into the community effort, repairing roofs, clearing debris, and distributing supplies. Mason's cheerful spirit was a beacon, his laughter and kindness lifting the spirits of those around him. At one point, he handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman, her eyes welling up with gratitude. Mason's small gesture spoke volumes, showing the resilience of their family and the bond that had carried them through the storm. A gentle pat on the cheek and a warm voice broke the stillness. "You've got a good heart, young man," an elderly woman said, her weathered hand lingering on Mason's face. Caleb, meanwhile, stayed in the background, his quiet dedication speaking louder than words. Tirelessly, he worked alongside John, hammering nails and securing shingles on unstable rooftops. His focus was a force of nature, unshakable and precise. One day, a gruff neighbor who had barely acknowledged them before walked over, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You're raising good boys," he muttered. John, wiping sweat from his brow, smiled gently. "I'm just helping them be who they already are." The storm, though devastating, had become an unlikely bridge. People who had once avoided eye contact now rolled up their sleeves and joined the Parkers. At a community potluck held to thank the volunteers, the room buzzed with laughter and stories. Mason and Caleb were at the center of it, seamlessly blending in, as though they'd been part of Springfield all their lives. When the mayor rose to speak, the room quieted. "In times like these, we see what people are truly made of," he said, his voice steady. "John Parker and his boys have shown us the very best." The applause was deafening, thunderous, wrapping around the room like a warm embrace. For the first time, John felt something new, acceptance. Later that night, as they shared leftovers from the potluck around their small table, Mason's voice broke the quiet. "Do you think Mom and Dad would have been proud of us?" he asked, his eyes searching John's face. John's fork stilled, and his throat tightened. "I know they would have been," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm proud of you too." Caleb looked from Mason to John. "We're proud of you too," he said softly. The simplicity of his words carried a weight that made John's chest ache with emotion. As the weeks passed, Springfield began to transform. The once closed doors began to creak open. Neighbors who had once scowled now waved as they passed. Conversations replaced whispers of disapproval. The storm had left scars, but it had also planted seeds of connection. One Saturday afternoon, as Caleb and Mason played basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. Out stepped Mr. Peterson, one of the town's most outspoken critics. He held a small, weathered toolbox. "I heard you're working on that old gazebo at the park," he said, his tone awkward. "Thought you might need an extra hand." John hesitated but then extended his own hand. "We could use the help." That afternoon, Caleb sanded the gazebo's rails while Mason painted. By evening, the structure gleamed in the fading sunlight, a symbol of shared effort. Peterson lingered just long enough to sip lemonade with the family on their porch. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. The change wasn't just among individuals. Caleb's basketball team organized a fundraiser for families still recovering from the storm. It was Mason who suggested donating part of the proceeds to fix the playground at the community center. When Mason pitched the idea to the team, some hesitated. "What if we don't raise enough?" one boy asked. Mason grinned. "Then we'll keep going until we do." The fundraiser succeeded, and when Mason handed over the check, even Springfield's toughest skeptics softened. At a town council meeting, Mrs. Aldrich, known for her sharp tongue, stood to speak. "This is all happening too fast," she said, her tone less cutting than usual. Before John could respond, Caleb raised his hand. The room stilled. "People can change," Caleb said firmly. "If we can, so can you." The words lingered in the air, and Mrs. Aldrich quietly took her seat, her expression pensive. The true turning point came at the town's 4th of July celebration. The Parkers arrived early, setting up chairs and tables for the event. As fireworks illuminated the night sky, Mason sat on John's lap, his face glowing with awe. Beside them, Caleb's expression mirrored the same quiet wonder. As the final firework burst into a shower of gold and silver, Mason leaned against John's chest. "We belong here, don't we?" he whispered. John's smile was soft but resolute. "Yeah, buddy, we do." A decade passed, and Springfield grew in ways that couldn't be measured by new buildings alone. John's house became a beacon, a place where neighbors gathered and children played. Caleb, now 20, studied architecture at the University of Kansas, returning home often to design projects that brought the town together. Mason, 17, with his natural charisma, led youth programs at the community center, fostering a sense of belonging for kids from every background. On a warm summer evening, the town gathered at the community center for a dedication ceremony. A plaque was unveiled, honoring the Parkers for teaching Springfield the meaning of community. As the crowd dispersed, Caleb approached John. "We couldn't have done this without you," he said. John shook his head. "You made your own paths. I just gave you the tools." Mason joined them, carrying 3 plates of pie. "Saved the last pieces for us," he said, grinning. The three sat together, the sky darkening as stars began to twinkle. Caleb broke the silence. "I think Mom would have been proud." John looked at his sons, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have been. And so am I." As laughter echoed in the distance, John realized something profound. The house he'd built wasn't just a shelter. It was a foundation, one that had rippled far beyond its walls, shaping a community and leaving a legacy of hope.